guys. Happy Tuesday. I am recording this actually Thursday, right before our meeting on Google Hangouts. I hope that I got to see all of you. And if not, as a quick announcement, don't forget that I will have those every Thursday. I won't always send the link out. Probably what I'll do from now on is I will just post the link on the Canvas webpage, and you can join. And remember, that is for just catching up, saying hi to people, me or not me. It's fine if you just want to say hi to each other. We'll probably do a little like share time at the beginning, but you don't have to share if you just want to be there. And then if you have questions, you can ask questions, and we'll just kind of go from there, and we'll see how it goes. I am going to have one that is mandatory for just your class period. So I'll set up two different ones during the class period time, and that'll be after we do we finish poetry. And you will have the option, if you wish, to share either one of your poems that you wrote for extra credit, or just bring a poem to read. We're going to have a virtual poetry reading. Okay, so everyone will need to read something, but you don't have to read something that you wrote if you don't want to, which I totally understand. It's hard enough for me to just post them for you to read if you want, knowing full well that many of you will not. It still makes my stomach turn thinking about some of you reading my poetry, because I feel like it's not very good. But that is just a heads up for things to come. If you anticipate that you might not be able to make it to a class meeting, just let me know, okay? And we'll figure something else out for you. All right, so I'm looking at my cheat sheet. Just make sure to turn in your poems. Make sure that your poems are highlighted with all of the literary elements, even unintentional ones. So you'll, after you write it, go back through it and look for things maybe that you did unintentionally or inadvertently, and label those as well. Okay. One thing I noticed from your first poems about poetry is a lot of you used enjambment, but you didn't label it. Okay. Another thing, and we're going to talk about this in the lesson today, make sure that you use punctuation purposefully to help the reader know when to pause and stop and so forth. But we'll talk more specifics about that after we look at one of our poems today. For Thursday, remember you are going to need a copy of the nonfiction book that you're going to be reading, and then a URL if you are getting it online. Okay. Okay, so we're going to get started with the lesson. You are going to need to have the notes out. I actually made a sheet of notes for you that have the poems that we're going to look at on there. So if you haven't opened that up yet, go ahead and do that here in a moment. Don't shut me off quite yet. So we're going to read through one of the poems together, and then The Bells by Edgar Allan Poe. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that first, and then I'm going to stop talking, and you're going to pause me, and you're going to listen to it. It's a long poem, and the guy who reads it really does a bang-up job. He is very good at really getting the emotion across in the poem, and I don't think I could do as good as he did, so I'll have you listen to the pro. So if you don't have your notes, go ahead and pause it here. Okay, welcome back, guys. We're here on the notes. Obviously, my page is blank, but you're going to be able to add things to it. In fact, I'll add things to it, so that way you don't have to pause the video and stuff like that. It'll be more accurate, I guess. But I do want you to, there's something to be said, like in educational psychology, about the physical process of doing stuff helps you remember it better. So if you think it's just unnecessarily tedious, I'm sorry, but science and stuff. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the other two types of poetry today. Last week you talked about narrative poetry, which is one of the types. One of the other types that we're really not going to talk about in great detail is dramatic poetry. And dramatic poetry is poems that are a play. Now that sounds weird, and there's probably a more precise definition, but that's what we'll go with. My example for you is Shakespeare. So I don't know if you've noticed this before. I hope I pointed it out to you last semester, but maybe I didn't. Shakespeare's plays are written in poetic form. If you go back and look at Shakespeare, the line breaks are weird, which is another reason why people don't understand Shakespeare, because they don't read it correctly. They pause at the ends of the line, even though there is no punctuation telling you to do so. But the entire poem, or rather the entire play, is written as a poem, and many of the lines are written in couplets, two rhyming pairs. And he usually does that when he's trying to make the character sound eloquent. So or very pretentious. So in Twelfth Night, Malvolio probably would have talked in couplets, as well as Feste the Fool, but probably not like some of the other minor characters that didn't really play as big of a part, or people that Shakespeare wanted you to think were ignorant. Okay, so there are other examples, but I don't know that you would be familiar with them. So your example here is Shakespeare's plays. So maybe I'll be a bit more specific there. His plays, not like his sonnets that I had you memorize. Those are not dramatic poetry. Those are this next one, which is lyric poetry, which is what we will be talking about mostly today. The definition of lyric poetry is poetry that expresses feelings and emotions. Okay? And that is what most of you think of when you think of poetry. In fact, several of you on the discussion board talked about either that was the reason you liked it because it was, emotional and that sort of thing, and that is the reason why some of you dislike it because you don't like all of the emotion and whatnot. I've got the examples down here for you, so you don't need to write anything here. The first poet we're going to talk about today is Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was a British fellow, alive back in the 1700s, and he wrote a lot of poems that you've probably heard parts of and just didn't know it. But one of his books of poetry is called In Memoriam. And actually, I just recognized an error on here. It's going to be right on your screen because I'm going to fix it now. But it's a book of poetry, not a single poem, so it should be in italics, not quotation marks. But this poem, I think you will recognize at the end. But he wrote this book of poetry shortly after his best friend in the entire world since childhood died tragically in an accident. And Tennyson was just devastated for a really long time. And one of the ways he kind of made it through that time was by getting his emotions out through verse. And so I'm going to read this excerpt for you, and you can follow along with me. I envy not in any moods the captive, void of noble rage, the linnet born within a cage that never knew the summer woods. I envy not the beast that takes his license in the field of time, unfettered by the sense of crime, to whom a conscience never wakes. Nor what may count itself as blessed, the heart that never plighteth troth, but stagnates in the weeds of sloth, nor any want begotten rest. I hold it true, whate'er befall, I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And it's that last two lines that I think maybe you might have heard before. It's kind of a popular phrase. But let's go through some of this poem together. So in this first stanza, or group of lines, this is actually a quatrain. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But he talks about he doesn't envy things that are captive and void or they don't have noble rage, like a lion in a cage, and they're just kind of there and not necessarily angry about it. The linnet, which is a bird born within a cage, again, captive, that never knew the summer wood. So he doesn't envy things that are protected. It's kind of what he's talking about there. The next stanza, I envy not the beast that takes his license from the field of time, unfettered by the sense of crime. So he doesn't envy beasts that don't know right from wrong, whom conscience never wakes. So he doesn't avoid those held captive who don't know anger or wonder in the woods. And that's the second stanza. He doesn't envy beasts who just rage and don't know right from wrong. Then the third stanza, nor may I count itself, or what may count itself blessed. So not even good things. Some people might think that it's great not to ever, the heart that never plighteth troth, but stagnates in a weeds of sloth. So a heart that never knew heartbreak. And then in this last stanza, he says here, I hold it true whatever befall. I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. That it's better to have those sense of sorrows than to never have had the opportunity for sorrow. Okay, so lots of emotion there. And a few things I want to talk to you about too is his use of rhyme. It's not couplets. Moods and rage don't rhyme. You do have a couplet here, rage and cage, but it is kind of sandwiched by another rhyme. So this rhyme is A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, E, F, F, E, G, H, H, G. Okay, I think I did that right. So that is kind of a different rhyme scheme. Also notice the importance of punctuation. He uses like a comma when he just wants you to pause. He uses the colon to let you know he's kind of talking a little bit more on the same lines. And then he kind of repeats that same thing, but he does occasionally do a full stop where you are supposed to stop. So kind of all of this is tied together, all of the things he doesn't envy, full stop. And then he goes into his true message in the poem. Okay, so punctuation is super important, and I want you to pay attention to that today when you do your assignment. Okay. Next is Edgar Allan Poe. Surprise, surprise. I wanted to talk about a few things. For one, this has a lot of emotions, a lot of different emotions in it, but also it brings up some really good poetic elements that I want you to know. So pause this video here and click and listen to the voice actor read the poem to you. Okay, now that you've heard that great reading of The Bells, I know it's kind of a long poem, but it's really good. And it brings up a lot of poetic elements, and we're not even going to talk about all of them. This poem is rife with all kinds of things. But some of the big things that I want to point out to you, and you've got terms at the bottom of your paper. I'm going to scroll down and show you where that is real fast. So you're going to type things in here, and I am going to label them up at the top. The labels will be gone when you get this, but you can put them in if you would like for a frame of reference. But I'm going to scroll back up to the top. The first one we're going to talk about is assonance, which is very similar to alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds, and there's tons of that, but I know you know what that means. So TTT, again, TTT, tintinnabulation, bells, 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 lots of alliteration. Assonance, on the other hand, is the repetition of consonant sounds within a word. And that does go hand in hand many ways with rhyme, but the words don't have to rhyme to have assonance. The thing that Poe does so well here is he uses the sounds of words to mimic the bells, and that lends itself very easily to assonance. So you've got bells, and like sledge, bells. Then you have a lot of I sounds, silver, oops, sorry about that, silver, tinkle, twinkle, sprinkle, crystalline, like all those I kinds of sounds that kind of lend themselves to the little sleigh bells that you hear. They kind of make that sound almost. And then in the second part where he's talking about wedding bells, mellow, golden, all the O sounds, O moon, O out, euphony, voluminous. I said that wrong. Um, but you get the idea that they're a rounder sounding bell. And so he uses those O's. And then the same throughout the alarm bells. He uses much harsher sounds, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So that's assonance, the repetition of consonant sounds. The next term is imagery, which I know you know about when it comes to sight. But imagery technically is not just about visual imagery. Imagery is when writing appeals to any of the five senses, so sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. And here in this poem, Poe uses a lot of sound, not alliteration, sorry, sound imagery. Like I was talking about how he makes the words kind of almost sound like the bells. Tinkle, 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 tintinnabulation, the molten golden notes. That assonance and sound imagery kind of play hand in hand, okay? The next two terms actually go together, euphony and cacophony. Euphony is something that sounds pretty, and cacophony is something that sounds harsh. The Greek root eu, means good, and kako means bad. And so those kind of help you understand. And then fawn, of course, means sound. But there are a lot of places in the poem that sound beautiful, as I was talking about the wedding bells. And then cacophony is more the last two, the alarm bells, brazen bells, tale of terror, their turbulency tells. Like all of those kind of shrieking, those kinds of words add to the cacophony of the sound. And then these are more like funeral bells, not so much cacophonous, but he does use words that kind of are negative, the ghouls, and you could hear the voice actor even like kind of relay some of that emotion as he was reading it. So he did a really good job. So those are your poetic terms. I'll be back in just a second and we'll go over your homework. Okay, guys, so I buzzed through the end there kind of quickly because it was time for me to go to our Google Hangout and I needed to get that started. But if you have questions, let me know, email me. Assonance, imagery, euphony, and cacophony were the four terms. Your assignment for today is to write a lyric poem. So it needs to convey emotions and feelings, and those don't have to be the kind of traditional what you think of when you think of poetry. Like a lot of you talked about love or like being super depressed. And yes, those emotions do lend themselves very well to poetry, lyric poetry specifically, but it could be something that you're extremely happy about or something like that. Be careful that it doesn't turn into a narrative. So don't tell me a story, tell me about your emotions. So for example, in Tennyson's poem, he didn't talk about the death of his friend. He talked about his emotions surrounding the death of his friend. But so yeah, to just be careful that you don't cross over into narrative and tell me about why, like the story of your happy or the story of your sad. Okay. Two things that I want to make sure that you do. First of all, like we talked about, paying attention to punctuation. In Tennyson's poem, he used different kinds of punctuation to signify different kinds of pauses. So if you remember the 3 stanzas that kind of were talking about the things that he's not envious of, didn't have like hard stops or full stops or a period at the end, because it all kind of went together. So he used other things, dashes, commas. Those are kind of pauses. Colons, semicolons are a little harder break. And then a period or a full stop is just that. It is where you stop and then continue. Okay, so be aware of how you use punctuation. You don't need to label that, just do it correctly. And then I want you to use at least 2 types of imagery. You can use visual imagery if you'd like, but I want you to use one of the other 5 senses as well. The 5 senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Okay, so figure out a way to get 2 types of imagery mixed into your poem. On the assignment, there is an example that I wrote. Disclaimer, I did write it about like an actual emotional experience of mine. So if you are uncomfortable with knowing things about my personal life, then don't read the poem. Look at one of the other examples, or you could even Google lyric poetry examples, and the internet will give you mazillions. That's not a real number, but that's how many there are. Yeah, a mazillion. Okay, so it was good to see those of you who showed up to the Google Hangout. I just got finished with that, and saw several of you. If you come to the next Google Hangout, which is this Thursday, I will give you some extra credit. All right, bye guys.